So because the hamstrings, there's 3 of them on the back. We have our biceps femoris, our semitendinosus, and our semimembranosus. Now, depending on how my pelvis is actually rotated on this fixed femur, I can address a certain hamstring. My name is Nick Smith, licensed physical therapist and strength and conditioning coach, and today I want to talk about the Kickstand Romanian deadlift. Now, I really like this exercise because depending on whatever your intent is, we could address things to work on your feet, your knees, your hips, your back, or if you're doing it for just strictly for hypertrophy, we can focus on how it affects the posterior chain of the hamstrings and the glutes. Now, when we're talking about the kickstand, what we want to look for is how our position is starting with our foot. So when I'm in the kickstand position and we're going to use my right leg, what I'm looking for is to make sure that the center of my ankle is lined up between my second and third toe. Now, oftentimes, some folks, which is very normal, they might have what we call a midfoot pronation. Now, a lot of people will be like, oh, you have flat feet. And it's like, well, maybe. You might have a flat foot, but you can also train that muscle to go into what we call a short foot position or creating that arch. So for the sake of this exercise, we want to make sure that there's a little bit of activation of our short foot here to make sure that the center of our ankle is lined up with between our second and third toe. Moving up the chain, our patella or our kneecap is going to be directly above the ankle and above the second and third toe. Moving all the way up to the ASIS, or that little bony prominence on our pelvis, that is stacked on top of our knee. So if you look at this position, everything is nice and straight. Now, traditionally, when we're thinking about hip strength, we use muscles can be trained in what they call a stabilizing function and of dynamic function. So when we're training our hips, we tend to move them in space. These are open kinetic chain or dynamic strengthening. Now, what makes the Kickstand RDL cool is that the femur remains fixed while the pelvis is actually moving. So it trains the muscles in a different way that you're not traditionally using when you're doing other types of exercises. So I'm gonna use a little bit of weight here to load this up. Starting with our foot position, now that we're stacked up with our leg, all that's gonna happen is I'm gonna let this kettlebell or whatever weight that you have, you're just gonna have it drag down the front of your leg. Now, in order for me to have it drag down the front of my leg, I'm gonna turn sideways here. My hips are gonna have to sit back. When I sit back, I'm creating tension through the posterior chain. I'm feeling some tension in my glutes, I'm feeling it in my hamstrings, and I'm feeling a little bit in my calf as well. Most of my weight remains on this right leg as I sit back. And as soon as I feel that tension, I'm gonna take the pressure of my foot, push into the floor, and push myself back upward. So I'm not initiating through my back, but I'm initiating through my foot. So the hamstring and posterior chain is lengthening as I come down, and then it's shortening as I come back up. So because the hamstrings, there's 3 of them on the back, we have our biceps femoris, our semitendinosus, and our semimembranosus. Now, depending on how my pelvis is actually rotated on this fixed femur, I can address a certain hamstring. So if I were to rotate my pelvis slightly towards my leg, the kettlebell is gonna slide down towards the outside of my shin, and I'm gonna feel the inside hamstring a little bit more groin. If I were to rotate my pelvis slightly away from that lead leg, I'm gonna feel it a little bit more on the outside here. And what's also great about this exercise is you can maintain that contraction through a full range of motion. So this is also gonna be really helpful for injury reduction and making sure that you can continue to do your sports.